The 24th of October had always been Evelyn's favorite day of the year. As a child, her mother would wake her before dawn, press a small posy of wildflowers into her hands, and whisper that the world had been made a little better the day she arrived in it. There would be warm bread with jam, a walk along the garden path, and always, always, a single candle pressed into whatever cake cook had managed to prepare, however humble. That was a long time ago. Her mother was gone now, and the woman who had replaced those simple, tender mornings was Lady Evelyn Ashworth, Duchess of Windermere, wife to one of the most powerful men in Yorkshire, resident of Ashworth Hall with its 40 rooms and its endless corridors and its portraits of ancestors who all seemed to stare down at her with mild disapproval. She sat in the drawing room at 7:30 in the evening, her hands folded in her lap, wearing her finest gown, a pale blue silk she had purchased herself 3 months ago, hoping for precisely this occasion. The fire beside her had been burning for 2 hours. The tea had gone cold. She had not touched it. She was waiting. She told herself she was not waiting. She told herself she was simply sitting, enjoying the warmth, perhaps reading, though the book lay closed on the arm of the chair, untouched since she had placed it there at 6 o'clock. She was waiting for her husband. The hall outside was not quiet. That was the cruelest part of it. There was movement everywhere, the quick steps of footmen, the rustle of silk, the sharp instruction of the housekeeper, Mrs. Petworth, directing someone to fetch the second-best travelling trunk from the upper landing. Carriages were being prepared in the courtyard below. She could hear the horses. She called to a passing housemaid. "Where is the Duke this evening?" The girl stopped. Something flickered across her face. Not quite pity, not quite embarrassment. "His Grace is preparing to depart for Hartwell, my lady. Miss Serena Voss's birthday celebration." Evelyn heard the words. She understood them. She even nodded, calmly, as though the information were perfectly ordinary. "Thank you," she said. "That will be all." She turned back to the fire. Serena Voss, 26 years old, daughter of a minor baronet from Cheshire, and the most elegant woman Evelyn had ever had the misfortune of standing beside at a dinner table. Adrian had known her for 3 years. Evelyn had known about her for 2. The entire county, she suspected, had known about the arrangement from the beginning. Everyone except the person it mattered most to inform. At 7 minutes to 8, Adrian appeared in the doorway of the drawing room. He was dressed magnificently. Dark coat, silver waistcoat, cravat tied with the particular precision that his valet had perfected over years of practice. He looked every inch the Duke he was. Tall, broad-shouldered, the kind of man who commanded attention simply by occupying a room. He had dark hair that had begun to grey slightly at the temples, and the sort of jaw that portrait painters adored. Evelyn had once found him impossibly handsome. She supposed, in some distant, technical sense, she still did. "I am going out," he said. "Yes," she said. "I heard." He glanced at her gown, a single, brief glance, the kind one gives a piece of furniture when checking it hasn't been moved. "Don't wait up." He was gone before she could say another word. She heard his footsteps cross the marble floor of the entrance hall. She heard the great front door open and close. She heard the carriage wheels begin to turn on the gravel. Then there was nothing. She sat for a long moment without moving. The fire crackled. A log shifted. Outside, the wind pushed against the windows with the particular insistence of a Yorkshire autumn, rattling the glass in its frames. She was 24 years old today. Later, she could not have said how long she sat there. Long enough for the fire to burn low. Long enough for the hall outside to grow quiet as the household settled into the rhythms of an ordinary evening. Long enough for her to understand, with a clarity she had been avoiding for months, that she had been sitting in this chair, in various forms, at various hours, for the entirety of her 3-year marriage. Always waiting. always folding herself smaller so as not to take up too much space, always telling herself that patience was a virtue and that husbands were complex creatures and that surely, eventually, things would improve. She heard two housemaids passing in the corridor outside. They were whispering, and they were trying very hard not to be heard. Diamonds, apparently. A whole set, necklace and earrings both. And Her Grace? A pause, then, very quietly, nothing. The word landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. Nothing. She reached out and picked up the cold cup of tea. She looked at it for a moment. Then she set it down again. Something moved in her chest. Not the familiar dull ache of disappointment she had grown so accustomed to carrying. This was different. This was harder and quieter and far more dangerous. It was the feeling of a woman who has finally, after a very long time, stopped making excuses. She stood up. She crossed to the writing desk in the corner of the room, sat down, drew out a sheet of paper, and by the light of the single candle still burning on its stand, she began to write. Not a letter to Adrian. She had written him enough letters over the years, careful, measured letters that said everything politely and accomplished nothing. This letter was addressed to the steward of her late mother's estate in Devonshire. She had not been there since before her marriage. She had almost forgotten she still owned it. She wrote for 20 minutes without stopping. When she finished, she sealed the letter, set it where it would be found in the morning, and went to bed. She did not cry. She was done crying. The letter reached Devonshire in 4 days. The reply came in 7. Evelyn read it twice at the breakfast table, then folded it neatly, slipped it beneath her plate, and poured herself another cup of tea as though nothing of particular importance had occurred. Across the table, Adrian sat behind his newspaper. He had not looked up once since sitting down. He had not asked how she slept. He had not asked anything at all. She buttered her toast. "I intend to spend some weeks in Devonshire," she said. "The sea air will do me good. I have not been well." The newspaper lowered by perhaps 2 inches. Adrian regarded her over the top of it with the mildly distracted expression of a man being interrupted during something far more pressing. "Devonshire," he repeated. "My mother's estate, Thornfield Grange. You may recall I inherited it upon her death." A brief pause. "I recall something of the sort." "I shall take Mary with me, and perhaps one of the kitchen girls. I won't require much." The newspaper rose again. "As you like." That was the whole of it. No inquiry, no objection, no suggestion that perhaps his wife's sudden desire to retreat to a crumbling seaside property might warrant a single question. He turned a page. She finished her toast. 3 days later, she was gone. The road to Devonshire took the better part of 2 days by hired coach, and Evelyn spent much of it watching England change outside the window. Yorkshire gave way to the Midlands softened into rolling Somerset hills, and then gradually, slowly, the air itself began to change. Lighter, sharper, carrying something clean beneath it that she hadn't realized she'd been missing. By the time the coach turned down the narrow lane leading to Thornfield Grange, the light had that particular coastal quality she remembered from childhood. Pale gold, slightly restless, as though it couldn't quite decide where to settle. The estate was worse than she had expected. The front gate hung at an angle, one hinge rusted clean through. The drive was more weed than gravel. 2 windows on the upper floor had been boarded over at some point and never repaired. The kitchen garden was entirely lost beneath 3 seasons of unchecked growth. Her lady's maid, Mary, stood beside her in the drive and said nothing, which Evelyn appreciated enormously. "Well," Evelyn said after a moment, "it's ours." Inside was marginally better. The local steward, a stout and apologetic man named Mr. Foley, had arranged for the principal rooms to be aired and basic fires lit. The furniture was old and worn, but solid. The kitchen was functional. The roof, he assured her, was sound in all but the east wing. That night, she slept better than she had in months. She found her mother's letters on the third morning. She had been sorting through the contents of the small sitting room that had always been her mother's favorite, a low-ceilinged room with a south-facing window that caught the sun from mid-morning onwards. Inside the bottom drawer of an old walnut writing desk, beneath a collection of dried lavender and a broken brooch she half remembered from childhood, was a bundle of letters tied with faded green ribbon. They were not addressed to anyone. They were simply her mother's thoughts, written over what appeared to be several years in the careful, slightly old-fashioned hand that Evelyn would have recognized anywhere. She sat in the window seat and read them all. Her mother had not been a dramatic woman. The letters were not dramatic. They were quiet and honest, and they spoke plainly about things that women of their class were generally not supposed to put into words. The particular loneliness of a marriage built more on arrangement than affection. The strange grief of losing yourself gradually, so slowly you barely notice until one day you reach for some essential part of yourself and find it simply isn't there anymore. But there was something else in them, too. Towards the end of the bundle, something shifted. The handwriting became slightly more decisive, the sentences shorter and more certain. "I have decided," her mother wrote, in what appeared to be the final letter, "that waiting for another person to assign you your value is the longest and most fruitless wait there is. I wish I had understood this at 24 instead of 44. The estate wants attention, the tenants want a landlord worth the name, and I find, rather to my surprise, that I want things too." Evelyn sat with that letter in her lap for a long time. Then she put it carefully back with the others, retied the green ribbon, and went to find Mr. Foley. She had questions about the tenants, about the repairs needed on the east cottages, about the drainage problem in the lower field that apparently nobody had addressed in 4 years. Mr. Foley was surprised. He was also, she could tell, quietly pleased. They talked for 2 hours. That evening, over a simple supper of bread and cold ham, Evelyn drew up a list of everything that needed doing on the estate. It covered both sides of 2 sheets of paper. She looked at it for a moment. Then she added a third item to the top, above all the rest, in slightly larger letters than the others. "Decide who you intend to be." Spring came to Devonshire the way it always did on the coast, suddenly and with great confidence. One morning the hedgerows were bare, and the fields were the dull brown of a long winter, and then, almost overnight, there were primroses along the lane, and the smell of something green and alive coming off the sea. Evelyn noticed it on her way back from the Hallett farm, where she had spent the morning discussing the repair of a collapsed stone wall with old Thomas Hallett and his son, both of whom had initially regarded her with the polite skepticism reserved for landlords who arrive unexpectedly after years of absence. That skepticism had taken approximately 6 weeks to dissolve. It happened not because Evelyn made speeches or grand gestures, but because she turned up. She turned up in the mud, in the cold, in the thin February rain that came sideways off the channel. She learned the names of the tenants' children. She remembered them the following week. When the Prescott family's roof gave way in a January storm, she arranged temporary lodgings and ordered the repairs begun within the fortnight. When she discovered that 3 families on the far end of the estate had been paying a drainage levy for a drainage channel that had not functioned in a decade, she abolished the levy the same afternoon and wrote to Mr. Foley with instructions to have the channel properly dug before Easter. Small things, practical things, but the tenants noticed, and word spread the way it always does in small communities, quietly, thoroughly, and without any help from the person being discussed. By March, people were greeting her by name in the village market. She had not realized, until it happened, how much that would mean to her. Lady Constance Hartwell came into Evelyn's life on a Tuesday in late March, when her carriage lost a wheel on the lane outside Thornfield Grange, and her driver appeared at the front door requesting assistance. Lady Constance was 53, twice widowed, possessed of an extraordinary quantity of opinions, and the social confidence of someone who had long since stopped caring what anyone thought of them. She had sharp grey eyes, a wardrobe that suggested she had spent considerable time in Paris before deciding England suited her better, and the particular quality of directness that either charms a person immediately or sends them fleeing. Evelyn found her absolutely delightful. They took tea while the wheel was being repaired, and then they took a second tea because the conversation had not finished, and by the time Lady Constance's carriage was ready, she had invited Evelyn to dine at Hartwell Court the following Thursday. "You have good instincts," Lady Constance said, as she pulled on her gloves at the door. "And dreadful posture. We shall work on the second." Evelyn laughed for the first time in longer than she could properly remember. The Thursdays became a fixture. Lady Constance had opinions about everything, about the proper management of a country estate, about the particular cruelties of the London marriage market, about the way women of their class were trained from childhood to make themselves agreeable at the expense of making themselves known. She spoke about these things over excellent dinners with the comfortable frankness of someone discussing the weather. She also, gradually and without drawing attention to it, taught Evelyn things. How to enter a room, not walking in but arriving, the difference being entirely one of deciding, before you crossed the threshold, that you had every right to be there. How to speak to people of rank without shrinking, and how to speak to people of no rank with the same directness she used for everyone else. The particular art of a London season, which invitations mattered, which hostesses were worth cultivating, which rooms contained the conversations one actually wanted to be part of. "You will return to London," Lady Constance said one evening, with the tone of someone stating something already decided. "Perhaps," said Evelyn. "Not perhaps. The season opens in April. You will go, and you will go properly." She studied Evelyn across the table with an expression that was not unkind. "You have changed considerably since October. I think you may not have noticed." Evelyn considered that. "I feel different," she admitted. "You look different. There is a distinction between a woman who is present in a room and a woman who is merely occupying it. You have crossed that line somewhere in the last 4 months, and I doubt you can cross back even if you tried." Evelyn said nothing. But later that night, back at Thornfield Grange, she stood before the looking-glass in her bedroom for longer than she usually did. Lady Constance was right. She looked well. The coast had given her colour that no London drawing-room ever had. The months of early mornings and practical work had done something to her bearing that she couldn't quite name. She stood differently. She thought about Adrian, briefly. His expression that last morning over the newspaper, already somewhere else before he'd even put the paper down. She wondered if he had noticed she was gone. Then she decided, with a quiet and untroubled certainty that surprised her, that it didn't particularly matter. She had things to do. The London season opened in 6 weeks. She wrote to Lady Constance in the morning and said she would go after all. The Hargreaves Spring Ball was considered, by general agreement among those who attended such things, the true beginning of the London season. It was held every year in the 3rd week of April at Hargreaves House on Grosvenor Square, a vast, over-decorated townhouse belonging to Lord and Lady Hargreaves, who compensated for a distinct lack of personal charm with an extraordinary talent for assembling interesting people in the same room. Every year the ballroom filled with the same faces, the same titles, the same careful negotiations of rank and reputation conducted beneath the guise of dancing and champagne. Evelyn had attended 4 times previously as the Duchess of Windermere. She had not, in any meaningful sense, been noticed at a single one of them. She arrived tonight in a carriage with Lady Constance, wearing a gown of deep emerald silk that had been made by a dressmaker in Exeter whom Lady Constance had recommended with considerable insistence. It was not a showy gown. There were no excessive frills, no elaborate ornamentation. It was simply very well cut, and the color was extraordinary against her dark hair, and it had been made for a woman who intended to be seen rather than tolerated. The footman announced her at the top of the stairs. "Her Grace, the Duchess of Windermere." She descended. She felt the room shift before she had reached the bottom step. It was not dramatic, no gasps, no music stopping. It was subtler than that. A turning of heads, a pause in several conversations, the particular quality of attention that moves through a crowded room like a current beneath still water, invisible but unmistakable to anyone paying close enough notice. Lady Constance, one step behind her, said very quietly, "There you are." Evelyn smiled and kept walking. She had been in the ballroom for perhaps 20 minutes when she saw Adrian. He was standing near the far end of the room with a group of gentlemen she recognized from various house parties over the years. Lord Pemberton, Sir Charles Wick, a younger man whose name she couldn't immediately place. He had a glass of something in his hand and was mid-conversation, and he was looking at the door in the way that people do when they are waiting for someone specific to arrive. He found her instead. She watched the moment it happened. The casual sweep of his gaze across the room, and then the stop. The almost imperceptible stillness that passed through him. The way he looked at her for a full 3 seconds without any expression she could read, which was unusual for Adrian, who generally wore his disinterest as comfortably as his evening coat. She inclined her head, the way Lady Constance had shown her. Not a greeting exactly, more an acknowledgement. Gracious, unhurried. Then she turned away and accepted an introduction to the gentleman beside her. His name was Lord Nathaniel Ashford, Marquess of Caldwell. He was perhaps 30, with an easy manner and the kind of face that suggested he found most things genuinely interesting, rather than performing interest for the sake of politeness. He had been introduced to her by their hostess, Lady Hargreaves, who had a talent for placing people next to each other who would have something to say. He asked her about Devonshire. She was surprised enough that she answered honestly, about the estate, about the tenants, about the collapsed wall at the Hallett farm and the drainage channel that had been charging people money for a decade without functioning. He listened with the particular quality of attention that suggests a person is not simultaneously composing their own next remark. "Most duchesses of my acquaintance," he said when she had finished, "do not generally involve themselves in drainage channels." "Most duchesses of your acquaintance have presumably never inherited an estate where nobody else was going to." He smiled. It was a good smile, genuine and slightly crooked. "May I have the honor of this next dance, Your Grace?" She accepted. She danced 3 times that evening. Lord Nathaniel claimed the first, and later the supper dance, which was, in the language of London ballrooms, a statement of considerable interest and certain to be remarked upon. A Lord Ellsworth claimed the second, a man of 50 with kind eyes, who told her she reminded him of her mother, which moved her more than she expected. Adrian appeared at her elbow between the second and third sets. "You might have told me you intended to attend this evening," he said. She looked at him pleasantly. "You might have asked where I was at any point in the last 6 months." A muscle moved in his jaw. Around them, the room continued its bright, indifferent business of conversation and movement. "You look," he started. "Thank you," she said, before he could finish. "If you'll excuse me, Lord Nathaniel is waiting." She left him standing there. Later, from across the room, she caught a glimpse of his face as she took the floor with Lord Nathaniel. Adrian was watching them with an expression she had genuinely never seen on him before. It took her a moment to identify it, because it was so unfamiliar in connection with anything related to her. It was discomfort. She turned her attention back to Lord Nathaniel, who was saying something amusing about the Hargreaves' choice of floral arrangements, and she laughed, and the sound carried easily across the bright and crowded room. The invitation to Bath arrived on a Wednesday morning in early May. It came from Lady Forsyth, a formidable woman of 60 who hosted the most coveted house party of the season each year at her estate outside Bath, Forsyth Park. An invitation from Lady Forsyth was not merely a social courtesy. It was a declaration that you had been assessed, found worthy, and admitted to a particular circle that most of London spent considerable energy trying to penetrate. The guest list was never large, 40 at most, and it was assembled with the precision of someone who understood that the quality of a gathering depended entirely on who was in the room. Evelyn's invitation arrived the same morning as one addressed to the Duke. She noticed that. She said nothing about it. They travelled to Bath in separate carriages. Forsyth Park was everything Yorkshire wasn't, low and golden and surrounded by the particular gentle countryside of Somerset, where the hills rolled in easy curves and the light had a softness that Yorkshire never quite managed. The house itself was warm stone, 3 stories, with long windows that caught the afternoon sun and threw it across the floors in broad, generous rectangles. The guests assembled over the course of the first afternoon, and by dinner that evening, Evelyn had reacquainted herself with several faces from the Hargreaves' ball, met 3 she didn't know, and established herself beside Lady Forsyth at precisely the right moment to be introduced to the party's most interesting newcomers. Lord Nathaniel was among the guests. She was not surprised. His reputation as a thoughtful and agreeable companion made him exactly the sort of person Lady Forsyth collected. They greeted each other with the comfortable ease of people who have already passed the awkward early stages of an acquaintance and arrived somewhere more interesting. "Devonshire seems to agree with you," he said during dinner. "It did," she said. "London seems to as well, lately." London has simply finally noticed what was already there. She chose not to examine that remark too closely, but she found she was smiling at her soup. Adrian was watching. She felt it rather than saw it, that particular awareness of being observed by someone trying to appear as though they aren't. He was seated further down the table, beside a Miss Cavendish who was doing her considerable best to engage him in conversation, and to his credit, he was responding with adequate politeness. But his eyes moved. She noticed it twice during dinner, a glance down the table, quick and immediately redirected. The third time she noticed it, she simply continued her conversation with Lord Nathaniel and said something that made him laugh loudly enough that several other guests looked over. Adrian's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. She reached for her wine-glass. The following days settled into the pleasant rhythm of a well-managed house party. Mornings brought walking or riding across the Somerset hills. Afternoons were given to cards, music, and the sort of conversation that benefits from having nowhere particular to be. Evenings were formal. Dinner, followed by dancing in Lady Forsyth's long drawing-room, where the rugs were rolled back and a small ensemble played from the far corner. Lord Nathaniel sought her company with a consistency that the other guests began to notice. Their conversations moved easily across subjects that Evelyn had never had the opportunity to properly discuss in her years as Adrian's wife. Estate management, the particular problems facing rural tenants under absentee landlords, a shared interest in the natural history of the coastline, a book they had both read and disagreed about in ways that produced an excellent argument lasting the better part of an afternoon. He was, she found, one of the most genuinely interesting people she had met in years. The incident that set the party talking happened on the 4th evening. Lord Nathaniel had claimed the first dance, as he had made a habit of doing, and they were halfway through it when Adrian appeared at the edge of the dancing. He waited until the figure of the dance brought Evelyn close enough, then stepped forward. "I believe this dance was promised to me," he said to Lord Nathaniel, with a pleasantness that did not quite reach his eyes. Lord Nathaniel looked at Evelyn. Evelyn looked at Adrian with an expression of polite bewilderment. "I made no such promise." "Nevertheless," Adrian extended his hand. "My wife, Ashford." The 3 words were said quietly, but with a particular emphasis that Lord Nathaniel understood precisely. He inclined his head, gracious, unhurried, the manner of a man entirely secure in his own position. "Of course, Windermere. Another time, Your Grace." She took Adrian's hand because creating a scene at Lady Forsyth's party was not something she intended to do. They danced in silence for a moment. "That was unnecessary," she said quietly. "He has been at your side for 4 days. He has been agreeable company. He is pursuing my wife." She looked at him steadily. "You have a remarkable talent for noticing things at precisely the moment they become inconvenient for you." He said nothing, but she felt his hand tighten slightly at her waist, not possessively, or not only that. There was something else in it, something uncertain, that she filed away carefully and chose not to address. Around them, several guests were watching with the careful inattention of people paying close attention. Lady Forsyth, from her chair near the fireplace, observed all of it with an expression of quiet satisfaction. House parties, in her experience, were always improved by at least one genuinely interesting complication. The hunting party in Scotland was Lord Pembridge's idea. He extended the invitations in June, a fortnight at his Highland lodge near Inverness, open to a select gathering of families for shooting, riding, and the particular pleasure of Scottish summer, which offered long golden evenings and air so clean it felt almost medicinal after months of London. The lodge itself was a vast, dark-stoned affair that sat at the edge of a loch, surrounded by hills that turned purple with heather in late summer and reflected themselves perfectly in the still water below. Evelyn almost declined. She had been content enough in London, her mornings full, her evenings pleasantly occupied, her social footing now established enough that she moved through the season with an ease that still occasionally surprised her. Devonshire had given her something that London was quietly confirming, that she was perfectly capable of filling her own time without waiting for someone else to organize it for her. But Lady Constance, who had also received an invitation, wrote to her with characteristic brevity, "Come to Scotland. The grouse are irrelevant. The company will be interesting." Evelyn packed her trunk. The party assembled at Pembridge Lodge over 2 days in the second week of July. Serena Voss arrived on the first evening. Evelyn had known she would be there. She had prepared herself for it in the practical way she had learned to prepare herself for most things, not by rehearsing emotion, but by deciding in advance that she would be neither cold nor particularly warm, and that whatever Serena chose to do with the fortnight was entirely Serena's own concern. What she had not anticipated was how diminished Serena would seem. It was nothing she could have easily explained. Serena was as beautiful as ever, dark-haired, elegantly dressed, possessed of the particular social grace that comes from years of being the most admired woman in whatever room she occupied. But there was something watchful in her now, something that hadn't been there before, or that Evelyn had been too preoccupied with her own misery to notice previously. Serena watched her across the dinner table that first evening, with the careful attention of someone reassessing a situation they believed they had already resolved. The rumors began on the 3rd day. Evelyn heard them first from a young woman named Miss Partridge, who reported them with the breathless discomfort of someone delivering unpleasant news they feel obligated to share. The suggestion, apparently circulating among a small portion of the party, was that Evelyn's transformation over the past year had been entirely calculated, that she had remade herself deliberately to attract wealthy admirers, that her charitable work in Devonshire was performance rather than genuine feeling, and that Lord Nathaniel, in particular, was being pursued with mercenary intent. Evelyn listened to all of this without interrupting. "I see," she said, when Miss Partridge had finished. "Thank you for telling me." She spent the rest of that morning going about her business as usual, which happened to include a long conversation with 2 families from the Devonshire coast who had also been invited to the party. The Hallett cousins, from the village near Thornfield Grange, attending as guests of Lord Pembridge, who had known Thomas Hallett since boyhood. She had not arranged this. She had not known they would be there. But when the Hallett cousins encountered the rumors, as they inevitably did, small parties being what they are, their response was immediate and unequivocal. Old Mrs. Hallett, who was 70 years old and had survived 2 wars, 3 harvests, and a dishonest steward, had absolutely no patience for the suggestion that the woman who had rebuilt the East Cottages and abolished an unjust levy and turned up personally in February mud to inspect a collapsed wall had done any of it for the purposes of social advancement. She said so, clearly and to several people, and with the authority of direct experience. By the 5th day, the rumor had collapsed entirely under the weight of too many contradicting voices. What survived it was more damaging to Serena than anything Evelyn could have deliberately arranged. People had noticed the origin. Not many, and nobody said it plainly, but the understanding moved through the party in the way these things always do, without being spoken directly, and therefore impossible to deny or defend against. Lady Constance said nothing, but Evelyn caught her expression at dinner on the 6th evening and understood that she had drawn the same conclusion as everyone else. Adrian drew it too. She could tell by the way he looked at Serena now, not with the easy warmth she had witnessed at a distance for 3 years, but with something more measured, something that looked, if she was reading it correctly, uncomfortably like reconsideration. He sought Evelyn out the following morning. They walked along the lock path, not by arrangement, simply because they were both there at the same hour. "The Hallett woman speaks very highly of you," he said. "Mrs. Hallett is generous," Evelyn said. "She also tells the truth, which is more useful." A silence. "Evelyn." "It's a beautiful morning," she said pleasantly. "The loch is extraordinary in this light, don't you think?" He looked at the water, then at her. She kept walking at exactly the same pace. She was not ready for whatever he intended to say. She suspected he wasn't ready to say it properly either. Some conversations, she had learned, were worth making a person wait for. The Lake District in early autumn was the kind of place that made a person feel, however briefly, that the rest of the world and all its complications were happening somewhere very far away. Lord Pembridge's cousin, a quiet and generous man named Sir Edmund Farrow, owned a modest estate near Windermere, Farrow Hall, set back from the lake on a gentle rise, with a view across the water that changed colour with every shift of light. He hosted a small gathering each September, 8 or 10 guests at most, chosen more for compatibility than social standing. It was the sort of party where people actually talked to one another, rather than performing the talking of one another. And Evelyn had been glad of the invitation from the moment she arrived and found a fire already lit in her room and a small vase of late wildflowers on the windowsill. She had been there 3 days when Lord Nathaniel arrived. He had been in the north on estate business, his own properties in Cumberland, which he managed with the same practical seriousness that Evelyn had come to recognize as one of his more admirable qualities. He rode in on a grey afternoon with his coat damp from the rain and an apology to Sir Edmund for arriving later than expected. And then he found Evelyn in the library, where she had been reading since luncheon. "I hoped you would be here," he said. "I suspected you might come," she said. "Sir Edmund mentioned Cumberland." He sat down in the chair across from hers without waiting to be invited, which she had long since stopped minding. "How are you?" It was the way he asked it, directly, without social decoration, that always distinguished him from most of the men she encountered. He was not asking how she did, he was asking how she actually was. "Better than I was a year ago," she said. "Considerably." "You seem it." He paused. "Scotland was unpleasant for a day or two." "Scotland resolved itself." "Due entirely to your own conduct." She set her book down.
"Lord Nathaniel."
"Nathaniel," he said. "We have argued about a book for 3 hours and discussed drainage channels at a formal dinner. I think we have passed the point of Lord Nathaniel." She smiled despite herself. "Nathaniel, then." They walked the following morning along the lake path, where the water lay still and pewter grey beneath a sky that couldn't quite commit to rain. The fells rose steeply on the far shore, their lower slopes already beginning to turn amber and rust at the edges. He was quiet for longer than usual, and she let him be. She had learned over the course of their acquaintance that his silences were not uncomfortable ones. They were the silences of a person who was deciding how to say something properly rather than quickly. "I want to ask you something," he said at last, "and I want you to know that I ask it with complete respect for your situation and no expectation of any particular answer." She waited. "Do you intend to remain with Windermere?" The question settled over the path between them. A pair of lapwings crossed the sky above the lake, calling to each other in their strange, wavering voices. She had known, in some peripheral way, that this conversation was approaching. She had been aware of it the way one is aware of a change in weather, not precisely, but with enough certainty to have begun, quietly and without acknowledging it directly, preparing herself. "I don't know," she said. It was the most honest answer she had. "That is a fair answer." He stopped walking and looked at the lake. "I will not pretend my interest in you is purely friendly. I think you know that it isn't, and I think you have known it for some time, and I respect you enough not to perform ignorance about it." She said nothing. "But I am also not asking you to do anything. I am simply asking whether the question of your future is one you have begun to consider as genuinely open." He looked at her then. "Because if it is, I wanted you to know that someone thinks rather highly of the answer, whatever it turns out to be." She thought about it that night, sitting beside the window in her room at Farrow Hall, with the lamp turned low and the lake invisible in the darkness outside, present only as a faint sound, water moving against the shore. A year ago, she had sat beside a dying fire in Yorkshire, waiting for a husband who was delivering diamonds to another woman. A year ago, she had been folding herself smaller for so long she had almost forgotten what her actual shape was. She did not fold herself smaller anymore. She thought about Adrian, not with the old familiar ache, but with a clearer and more complicated feeling. Something had shifted in him since Scotland. She had seen it in the way he looked at her now, the way he had begun to appear in rooms where she was without quite managing to explain why. There was something genuine in it, she thought, or the beginning of something genuine. Whether the beginning was enough was a different question entirely. News of Nathaniel's interest, she knew, would reach Adrian. These things always did. She found, sitting quietly beside that dark window, that she felt no particular urgency about it. She had waited long enough for other people's realizations. This time, they could arrive at their own pace. The 24th of October arrived on a Thursday. Evelyn knew it was coming, the way one always knows, not with dread exactly, but with a particular quality of awareness, a slight bracing of oneself against whatever the day chose to deliver. Last year, it had delivered diamonds to Serena and a cold cup of tea to the Duchess of Windermere. The year before that, Adrian had been in Edinburgh on business he had forgotten to mention until the morning of her birthday itself. The year before that, she had waited in a dining room for a dinner that was served an hour late because he had extended his afternoon ride without thought for anyone else's arrangements. 3 years of marriage, 3 birthdays that had passed like ordinary Tuesdays. She had returned to London in the second week of October, following a quiet, final fortnight at Thornfield Grange that she had spent in a state of pleasant calm, walking the cliff paths, visiting the tenants one last time before winter, and writing long letters to Lady Constance about nothing in particular, and everything important. Devonshire had become something she carried with her now. Not a place she had escaped to, but a place that had handed her something essential and trusted her to keep it. London received her as it had learned to receive her this season. Invitations arrived daily. Her mornings filled themselves without effort. Adrian was in the townhouse when she returned. He had been there for a week already, and something in his manner had changed from even the last time she had seen him in the Lake District. Quieter, more deliberate, as though he were moving through his days with greater care than usual. She noticed it without remarking on it. On the morning of the 24th, she came downstairs to find the breakfast room transformed. It was not extravagant. That was the first thing she registered, and it was the thing that surprised her most. No excessive flower arrangements, no theatrical display. Instead, the table held a small arrangement of late autumn roses, deep red, her favorite, the variety that grew along the south wall at Thornfield Grange, which meant he had asked someone, had made an inquiry, had paid enough attention at some point to know. Beside her place setting was a flat parcel wrapped in brown paper, and beside that, a card in Adrian's own handwriting. He was already at the table when she entered. He stood when she came in, which he had not done in years. "Happy birthday, Evelyn," he said. She looked at the roses. She looked at him. She sat down. She opened the parcel carefully. Inside was a small, leather-bound volume, a collection of letters written by women of the previous century, naturalists and scholars, and one celebrated estate manager whose correspondence had apparently been published privately and was considered nearly impossible to find. She turned it over in her hands. "Lady Constance mentioned you had been looking for it," he said. "I wrote to 4 booksellers before one of them located a copy." She set the book down. Something moved in her chest. Not the old longing, not the grief of previous years. Something more complicated and considerably more difficult to dismiss. "Adrian," she said carefully, "why now?" He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the London street was beginning its morning business, the distant sound of hooves on cobblestone, a vendor's call from somewhere along the square. "Because I was a fool for 3 years," he said, "and I was a fool in very specific ways, on very specific days, and this is one of them." She had rehearsed, somewhere in the back of her mind, how she might respond if he ever said something like this. She had imagined feeling vindicated or cold, or perhaps simply indifferent after so much practice at managing without him. She had not imagined feeling this, a kind of careful, guarded tenderness that frightened her slightly because of how easily it could be misused. "Do you value me now?" she said quietly. "Because I have changed? Or because other people finally noticed me?" The question sat between them on the breakfast table like something solid. Adrian looked at her. The easy deflection she might have expected from him a year ago didn't come. He didn't reach for a comfortable answer. "I have asked myself that," he said, seriously, and more than once. "And?" He was quiet long enough that she knew he was not constructing something polished. He was finding something true. "I think," he said slowly, "that I was always surrounded by something I didn't have the sense to look at properly, and that other people looking at it forced me to see it. Whether that is the same as valuing you because of them," he stopped. "I don't know how to make that distinction cleanly. I'm not sure it can be made cleanly." She considered that. It was not the answer of a man performing remorse. It was the answer of a man genuinely, uncomfortably uncertain, which was, she thought, considerably more honest than certainty would have been. "I appreciate the honesty," she said at last. "It's rather the least I owe you." She looked at the roses again, then at the book, then at the man across the table who had spent 3 years looking past her and was now, finally, looking directly at her with an expression she didn't entirely know how to read yet. "I need time," she said, "and I need more than one morning." "I know," he said. I'm not asking for anything this morning." She poured her tea. For the first time in 3 years, someone else reached over and poured his. November in the English countryside arrives without ceremony. One morning, the last of the autumn color is still holding in the trees, and then a single cold night takes it all at once, and you wake to bare branches and frost on the grass, and a sky, the particular flat gray of a season that has made its decision and intends to stick with it. The ride from London to the Windsor countryside took just under 3 hours by carriage, and Evelyn spent most of it watching the landscape do exactly that, surrender its color quietly, without complaint, as though it had always known this was coming and had simply been waiting for the right moment. She had been invited to a small gathering at Caldwell Park, Lord Nathaniel's estate near Windsor, a modest and well-maintained property that reflected its owner's character with the kind of straightforward honesty that grand houses rarely managed. 8 guests, a long weekend, nothing more complicated than good food and decent company and long walks across the frost-stiffened parkland. Adrian was not among the invited guests. He knew where she was going. She had told him plainly over breakfast one morning in the second week of November, and he had received the information without objection, which she noted and filed away alongside the other things she had been noting and filing away over the past several weeks. The weeks since her birthday had been unlike any period in their marriage. Adrian had not made grand declarations. He had not arrived home with jewelry or booked theater boxes or attempted to replace 3 years of neglect with a concentrated fortnight of visible effort. She would have found all of that considerably easier to dismiss. Instead, he had been present. He appeared at breakfast most mornings. He asked with apparent genuine interest about the tenants at Thornfield Grange, the Hallett family, the drainage channel, the repairs on the east cottages that were ongoing through the autumn. He listened to the answers. He remembered them the following day and asked follow-up questions, which was the detail that undid her more than anything else, because it meant he had been paying attention after she left the room. He had written to the Devonshire steward himself, offering the Duke's direct support for the remaining repairs on the estate, not mentioning it to Evelyn until she discovered the letter by accident in Mr. Foley's correspondence. When she asked him about it, he said only that it seemed the right thing to do, and that he should have done it 2 years earlier. He had ended things with Serena in October. She knew this not because he told her. He had, quietly, one evening, in 3 plain sentences, but because the quality of his presence in the house had changed in a way that was difficult to articulate and impossible to mistake. She watched all of it carefully. She did not let it move her too quickly.
Nathaniel walked with her on the second morning at Caldwell Park, along the frost-covered path beside the kitchen garden where the last of the season's herbs stood skeletal and silver in the cold air. He had not pressed her since the Lake District. He had been, as he tended to be, exactly what the situation required: warm, present, entirely without urgency. "You seem different from September," he said. "Things have been different," she said. He nodded slowly. He had known, she thought, before she arrived. He was perceptive enough to have read the shape of it from her letters. "He is trying," she said. It was not a defense of Adrian, simply an accurate observation. "Yes," Nathaniel said. "I believe he is." She stopped walking. The frost-white garden lay quietly around them. Somewhere across the park, a woodpecker was working at a distant tree, the sound carrying cleanly through the cold air. "I owe you honesty," she said. "You have given me a great deal of it, and you deserve the same." "You don't owe me anything, Evelyn." "I do." She looked at him directly. "What you offered me, the regard, the friendship, the question you asked at Windermere, it mattered to me enormously. You saw me at a point when I was only just beginning to see myself, and that is not a small thing." He was quiet.
"But I think I need to go back," she said. "Not because I cannot manage without him. I have proved that rather thoroughly. And not because I am afraid of being alone, because I'm not anymore, but because something real is attempting to happen in that marriage. And I would not forgive myself for leaving before I knew whether it was capable of becoming what it should have been from the beginning." Nathaniel looked at her for a long moment. Then he smiled, a genuine smile, with something slightly rueful in it, and something that she recognized as real respect. "Then go back," he said simply. She returned to London on a Monday. Adrian was in the entrance hall when she arrived, which surprised her, as she had sent no word of her exact return. "I watched for the carriage," he said, by way of explanation. She handed her coat to the waiting footman. She looked at her husband, this man she had married at 21, who had spent 3 years looking past her and several weeks learning, with evident difficulty and evident sincerity, how to look properly. "I'm giving us 1 year," she said, "not because you have earned it yet, because I believe you are capable of earning it." Something moved across his face. Not relief exactly, something more serious than relief, and more grateful. "That is more than I deserve," he said. "Yes," she agreed. "It is. Don't waste it." She walked past him toward the stairs, and then she stopped and looked back once. "Adrian." He looked up. "Next year, on the 24th of October, she said quietly, "I expect wildflowers. Not diamonds. Wildflowers." He held her gaze. "I'll find them myself," he said. She nodded once and went upstairs. Outside, the November street carried on its business, hooves and voices, and the distant bell of a church marking the hour. The city moved as it always did, indifferent and continuous. But inside the house, something had shifted, quietly and without ceremony, the way the most important things tend to. Not with a grand flourish, just a door left slightly open, and 2 people deciding, carefully, whether to walk through it.